Welcome to Cooking for Moderately Lazy People, the series where those of you who want a tasty dinner and are willing to do some work, but, not too much work. Nobody's trying to make a multi-layer cake here. Cooking is something I really enjoy, and a few of my friends have suggested I try my hand at some cooking-related content. So, I'm going to give this a shot with one of my favorite recipes, the dish we jokingly refer to as tear gas pork. Now, I'm guessing you're asking yourself, what the hell is tear gas pork? That doesn't sound delicious at all. That sounds painful. Prep for this can actually be a bit uncomfortable, but it's worth it in the end. I will warn you though, when I make this recipe, I open every window in the kitchen and living room and turn the exhaust fan above the stove on. I still have a stack of masks from 2020, and I will put one of those on for this recipe. If you have respiratory issues, this might not be the meal for you. The recipe is one that I found online and modified slightly to my own tastes. The original recipe was for Vietnamese caramelized ground pork. It called for fish oil, which I subbed out because I don't like anything related to fish. Or any seafood. Basically, if its primary mode of transit is swimming, and or its species appears in any cartoon that is set entirely underwater, I'm out on eating it. The original recipe also called for a bird's eye chili, which I subbed out for a jalapeno. The former is actually a bit difficult to find in my area. If you prefer your food spicier, you could use a spicier pepper, such as a habanero. You could even drop a ghost pepper in here if that's what you're into. First, let's start by gathering our ingredients. First, we're going to need about half a medium onion. I'm going to cut this up just enough to get it into the food processor and let the food processor do the rest of the work for me. Obviously, smaller pieces would help it out some, but for the sake of minimizing effort, this should be fine. We'll then grab 2 whole cloves of garlic. We'll crush them, but we won't bother mincing them because, like the onions, they're going into the food processor. I won't get rid of these pesky husks, though. They aren't the most appetizing of things. After several more seconds of fumbling around with this and a quick edit to skip some of it, I'm going to grab the next ingredient, 2 teaspoons of minced ginger. Next, I'm going to grab the jalapeno pepper, which I'm going to cut in half and remove the seeds from. Before I do this, though, I'm going to put some gloves on because I don't want to forget that I handled a jalapeno pepper today, rub my eyes 3 hours from now, and have my eyes stinging for the next half an hour. Again, I'm going to do the bare minimum cutting this jalapeno because it, like the other stuff you can see right now, is going into the food processor. I'm going to do a couple of quick edits to skip some of this because this video is not how to remove the seeds from a jalapeno 101. And through the magic of editing, instantly seeded jalapenos. We're also going to need about 1.5 tablespoons of peanut oil, but I typically just eyeball the amount. Then there's 5 tablespoons of brown sugar, 2 teaspoons of sweet Thai chili sauce, and 1 pound of ground pork. The chili sauce is what I subbed in for the fish oil. If you like fish oil, you can use that instead of the chili sauce. And now we'll get to why shortly, but you're going to want to make sure you have all your ingredients gathered before you start cooking. Now we're going to put the onion, garlic, ginger, and jalapeno in the food processor and puree it. Henceforth, I will just refer to them as the vegetables because I double checked and technically, garlic and ginger are both vegetables. And of course, technically correct is, factually, the best kind of correct. And while I'm continuing to load up the food processor, I'll take a little bit of time to talk about the cost of this meal. Granted, all the prices I'm about to give are local to my area, so your mileage may vary. The ground pork costs around $4. The onion is usually around $1, and the jalapeno typically runs about 20 cents. The cost of the garlic, pepper, ginger, sugar, and Thai chili sauce are almost negligible because of the small amount of each that's used. The entire meal clocks in at under $6. And here we'll go ahead and start pureeing the vegetables. So, because I was lazy in the beginning and cut the vegetables into such large chunks, I had to run this puree for a couple of minutes to get it done. I even had to stop it, remove it from the blender, and fish a chunk of jalapeno that kind of got stuck to the blade and wasn't getting pureed out, and put it back in to give the blender another shot. Once we dump our vegetables out of the food processor, we have everything we need to start cooking proper. And this is where the importance of having all the ingredients ready to go comes back into play. We'll be working with the peanut oil on the stove at high heat, so we will not have time to retrieve anything. If we don't keep these ingredients in motion constantly throughout this process, they will get welded to the bottom of our wok. So now the wok is on the stove, and we'll go ahead and add the peanut oil. It's supposed to be about a tablespoon and a half. Like I said, I usually just eyeball this, maybe a little more. Yeah, there we go. Sure, that looks like about a tablespoon and a half to me. And now I'm going to reach across and turn the stove on to high, and now we are on the clock. Oh, and here's that mask I was talking about earlier. While this oil is heating up, I'm going to be donning this thing. And while this oil is heating up to shimmering, let's talk about where the tear gas part comes in. When the puree meets the hot oil, it's going to instantly vaporize a lot of the moisture in the component parts of the puree. This includes the jalapenos. When those jalapeno bits get exposed to the hot oil, it will effectively aerosolize some of the capsaicin in the peppers. When you do this with a jalapeno pepper, you effectively tear gas your kitchen. When you do it with a habanero pepper, you effectively tear gas your house. When I cooked this recipe the one time with the habanero pepper, I effectively turned my wok into a poor man's chemical weapon. That's where the joke name, tear gas pork, originated. I'm not exaggerating when I say that my roommate, who was in his bedroom and as far away from the kitchen as you can actually get in my house without going into the crawl space, had his eyes start watering and his throat get irritated from the habanero pepper. Turns out, this recipe might be the most delicious violation of the Geneva Conventions I've ever encountered. Again, through the magic of editing, I am going to skip ahead a bit until the oil's hot enough to put the vegetables in. And now, the fun begins. We're going to add the vegetables. And I cannot stress this enough, very, very carefully. This oil is ripping hot, and if you dump the vegetables straight into the oil, you will get massively splashed. I was careful about how I put them in, and I still got slightly splashed. I think some of it's unavoidable, but you want to minimize it. This is a recipe you have to have a little bit of toughness to pull off, or possibly a slight bit of masochism, or maybe some of both. The recipe calls for the vegetables to be moved around in the hot oil for about 2 minutes, but you're going to have difficulty timing this with having to keep the vegetables constantly moving. This is another one I just eyeball. When it looks about right, we'll move on to the next step. I'm sure you've noticed by now that I filmed this and then did the audio afterwards. The reason for that was I was pretty sure you wouldn't be able to hear me over the sound of the food processor and the hissing of the vegetables being cooked in the hot oil. And even if you could, that wouldn't be the best auditory experience. The other reason for post-production audio was that at some point, and I'm not sure without the original audio where in the video this happened, but at some point, I started coughing. Remember, this is tear gas pork after all. Granted, the coughing wasn't debilitating, it was just slightly annoying. But again, not the most fun thing to listen to. And we will skip ahead a bit again in order to move this video along. And now it's time to reach for the ground pork. We want to get this into the wok as quickly as possible so that we don't leave the vegetables sitting in the hot wok for very long. One thing I discovered, basically by accident one time, is that if you pile the vegetables up, you can put the ground pork directly on top of them and not have it touch the hot oil. This should mitigate some of the splashing. Once we have the pork in the wok, we brown it. To be honest, I've never bothered to look up a time on this. It would be really impractical to try to set a timer at this point, so I just do it by look. And while the pork is browning, let me talk about sides. Typically, when I make this, I make jasmine rice as a side in my rice cooker. Since my rice cooker also has a steamer, I will either make steamed carrots or steamed asparagus as a second side. If I do asparagus, I'll usually take it from the steamer and toss it in the wok after cooking, just to pick up some of the leftover flavor from the residue in the wok. I would recommend not adding the asparagus to the wok while it's still on the stove though, because you'll already have steamed it, and throwing it in that hot wok will overcook it very quickly. One of the good parts about this meal is that it has a relatively low prep time, because all the vegetables get pureed, and once you turn the stove on, everything runs pretty quick. I usually start the rice and steamed vegetables before gathering the ingredients for the pork, but the whole process still clocks in at around 20 to 25 minutes or so, including the sides. It can feed a family of 4, but probably not with leftovers, although for larger families, or hungrier ones, it scales to double pretty easily because there's definitely room in the wok. Time to skip ahead again because now we're just watching pink turn to light brown. Once we have the pork sufficiently browned, we'll reach for the next to the last ingredient, the brown sugar. We'll just dump it straight into the wok and keep stirring until the sugar coats the pork. The sugar will caramelize here, but it won't be a caramel color like a caramel candy. That might be due to the amount of the sugar that's used and the fact that it's coating pork. That being said, this is dinner, not dessert, so that's fine. The coating will turn the pork a darker brown though. It's tough to describe exactly what the correct level of brown is. That's just something I figured out by trial and error. Although some small clumps of sugar may stick together enough, they will start to look like caramel. I can usually use those as a rough indicator of when it's time to move on to the next step. And with one more magic edit skip, we're ready for the final ingredient, the sweet Thai chili sauce. I basically just dump this straight into the wok and then stir it around until it coats the pork and is warm. Once that's done, and it should not take long, we're going to remove the wok from heat and place our pork into a bowl for serving. I would definitely get it out of the wok once done, because with the residual heat, if you leave it in, it might burn and stick itself to the bottom. The recipe doesn't call for elbow grease, and I like to avoid using that as an ingredient when possible, so I moved the pork into a bowl instead. And there you have it, tear gas pork. The delicious and, depending on how spicy of a pepper you use, possible borderline war crime that makes for a relatively quick and inexpensive dinner. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like, subscribe, comment on, or share the video. And as always, thanks for watching. Oh, and if you make this, do remember to close all the windows once dinner is done. I may have forgotten that at least once.